Hi there, good evening everyone. We will start in just about a minute or two, but I just want to give a little bit of time for everyone who'd like to join us this evening to join the call. So we'll just start in about a minute or two, but feel free to grab a drink and get comfortable, and we will kick off shortly. Okay, I can see the numbers still ticking upwards fairly quickly, so we'll give it about another 30 seconds to a minute, and then we will start proceedings. And absolutely, just in answer to the question that I can already see in the Q&A box, we will be distributing a recording of this webinar. So if you have been on the mailing list for this and joined via that email invitation, and if you've clicked in basically to register for this seminar, you should automatically in the next few days be emailed a recording or a link to a recording of the full session. And you can also access it directly via our YouTube channel. So that's the Oxbridge Applications YouTube channel, where I suspect it will be uploaded in the next 4 or 5 days. So you can look back through it at your leisure. So review the slides, review what we've said, and you can also chat to us as a consultancy one-on-one, and we're very happy to do that too. Okay, so with all of that said, let's begin. A little bit of housekeeping to start. So firstly, thank you for joining. So thank you for joining this webinar, which is part of a series of seminars that we're running throughout basically the entire year, exploring various topics. So everything from super long-term planning for students who are in year 9, year 10, just starting GCSEs and so on, right through to kind of what might be considered the other end of the spectrum. So this webinar on reapplications. A little bit later in the year, we'll also be doing sessions on entrance tests, and on personal statements and so on. So lots of things to come. So feel free and kind of please do, but just generally stay subscribed to our mailing letters and our mailing lists, and you'll get all the information about all of that. And thank you also for giving up part of your evenings to hear me speak. We will try to keep this fairly brisk. So what I'll try to do with all of these sessions is go through lots of content relatively quickly and hope that's absorbed, or at least the relevant parts are absorbed. And then if something was a little bit missed, then either you can go back to the recording of the session and review that later, either from what I'm saying or on the slide itself. And as I was saying a couple of minutes ago, we will distribute the recording of this session in the next few days, or you can just speak to us directly. So I and other members of our team are always happy to chat, and I'll give on the final slide of this PowerPoint a little bit of information about how you get in touch with us directly. We're always happy to speak on the phone, always happy to organise a Zoom or a Teams call to catch up, and so very happy to chat about individual situations specifically and directly. Okay, so, and actually just on timings, then I will try to make this seminar a little bit shorter than some of the ones we've been doing over the last couple of months. So end goal is hopefully to make the main part of the talk about 30 minutes. So finishing about half past, just going through all of the main parts of thinking about a reapplication. And then we'll do about 15, maybe 20 minutes at the end for questions, which from my perspective, honestly tends to be the most valuable part of these sessions, actually getting some live responses to individual situations and specific questions you might want to pose. And in order to submit a question, and I'll try to get to at the end of this session as many of those questions as possible, then you can just do or can find the three dots at the top of your screen on the Zoom bar, and you can find the Q&A panel and just drop questions into that Q&A panel. So I'll probably not interrupt the flow of the presentation to kind of answer those live throughout, but right at the end, I will go through the full list of questions. So feel free to submit them live and I will get to as many as possible. Okay, so All of that said, let's start talking about reapplications and essentially what I'm kind of assuming most of you in a relatively similar position at the minute, what might happen next in terms of considering your options, in terms of thinking about reapplications. And kind of perhaps the note I want to begin on is just say that I'm a little bit sorry that we're here. So obviously it's been a stressful few months for all applicants targeting Oxford and Cambridge and other top universities. And in some cases, those applications end up being successful. So we've had Cambridge Offer Day that was early, also the Cambridge Offer Day that was about a week ago. And we had Oxford Offer Day about 2.5, 3 weeks before that. So in January of this year. And obviously on those days, we've got thousands of students hearing back with kind of either really good news or less happy, less kind of like cause for celebration news. And so it's trying to kind of work out if you are kind of unfortunately ended up on the wrong side of that cut, or even ended up on the wrong side of that cut at a slightly earlier stage. So some students don't quite make it through to the interview stage, and lots of the Oxford and the Cambridge courses have really, really steep interview cut-off rates. So for some courses, particularly Oxford at the moment, is interviewing as little as 20 or 25% of the total applicant pool. Essentially, you can kind of then be cut off even earlier in that process and end up not even getting to meet an admissions tutor and kind of show off what you can do in person, which is obviously a particularly frustrating situation to be in. But at this point in the year, we've got lots of students who are beginning to think a little bit about what their next steps might be if they've ended up without, obviously, an offer either from Oxford or from Cambridge, which is what we'll focus on mostly today, but also more broadly towards a university which kind of they'd be happy to attend. So one of their top 1, 2, 3 choices on the UCAS form, particularly if they've been very ambitious with those top 2 or 3 choices, quite often, particularly with competitive courses, it is a really, really small fraction of applicants who end up with the happy email at the end of the day rather than the sad email. And so a lot of students who've ended up with that sad email who are almost always bright, promising applicants who in many cases have simply got unlucky or kind of got caught out by kind of some tiny error or by some kind of final margin of some tiny marginal decision making. They're thinking about their options. They're thinking about what happens next. And they're thinking about, okay, if I'm not quite happy with the university offers I've got already in the bag, and of course, not all offers have come through yet. So not all university decisions have come through this cycle. Particularly the London universities are quite often slow to send through their decisions. Then you might well be beginning with a slight sense of dissatisfaction, thinking, okay, none of the others I've got or I am likely to get or think I'm likely to get this cycle are ones I'm happy with. I'm not excited about applying or I'm not excited about attending any of the universities I got the offer from. And so today's session is discussing this broad idea of thinking about a reapplication, what might happen next if it's something that you're considering, how to think about it strategically as a process, and how all of that might fit together alongside obviously completing the studies, so finishing secondary school, completing A-levels, the IB, similar curriculums, and so on. So just to do, and I apologize if you are going to be bored with this, because I appreciate this is essentially how we've begun every single seminar in this series. Just to introduce ourselves, so we're Oxbridge Applications, as many of you may well already know, and essentially we're a consultancy that helps support students applying to top UK universities and increasingly also competitive universities worldwide. So we've been working in the space for more than 25 years now. We work with a significant majority of the UK's top 100 independent schools, as well as lots of high-performing academy trusts and so on. We work with Oxbridge tutors in pretty much every single academic field, and we support applicants targeting every single one of the Oxford and Cambridge undergraduate courses that are offered every year, as well as the vast majority of postgraduate programs and courses as well. A lot of our work is informed by research, by working closely with ex-admission staff, so people who have been admissions tutors at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge and so on, as well as pulling data from the universities, both from their own kind of public releases, but also freedom of information requests and so on. And essentially all of that arcs towards collectively supporting students who, as I kind of briefly referenced, are applying to all top global universities. So not just Oxford and Cambridge, but G5 Russell Group universities in the UK, Ivy League and kind of similarly competitive universities in the US, Canadian universities, mainland European universities, increasingly also East Asian universities, and so on. Who am I? So the other question. I'm Tom, and essentially I lead the consultancy team at Oxbridge Applications. So essentially I exist to meet students, to meet applicants, to talk to them about applying to these universities, help them build up strategies about how they go about that process, how they improve their chances, how they think about the whole application, and trying to make sure that they end up with the best chance of university offers that they're going to be happy with and on courses at universities that are going to give them a really good 3 years of education, a really good 3 years of life, and so on. But what we'll cover today, which is the stuff that has not been covered in every single webinar we've done for the last 3 or 4 months, got a few key areas here. So the first thing I want to discuss is whether to reapply, which is obviously the big decision to make initially. The second question is this discussion around how to reapply. So how does it work logistically, and cover off a few of those questions. And then the third element, or the third strand of what we'll cover today, is talking a little bit about reapplication strategy and tips. So giving some general kind of quite broad brushstroke advice on how to think about the reapplication, how to approach it, giving some kind of top line tips that might give you a sense of kind of the shape of the reapplication, what to focus on, how to approach it, how to kind of balance the workload over the next year, and so on. So to jump straight in with essentially the question of, should I reapply? So if you are an applicant on this call, or if you're an applicant who kind of comes back and watches this call, or a parent of an applicant who you know is considering potential reapplication, then this is the big question in your mind at the moment. So first, a point of reassurance, and that's that crucially at the moment you have time. So on UCAS, the UK University Application System, you must reply to any offers you've got by the 3rd of June. So you must effectively accept, if you want to accept any of the offers a university has given you by the 3rd of June. I will emphasize, however, that even once you've locked that in on UCAS, you are not locked in contractually. It's not like kind of a private American university where they literally kind of bind you contractually to attendance, and there are kind of significant repercussions if you don't. You are not kind of locked in completely until you are literally signing up for accommodation, beginning to pay the first instalment of tuition fees, and so on to UK universities. So as long as you don't leave it too late, as long as you're not pulling out of a university place that they've reserved for you and that you've locked in literally a week or 10 days before the start of your first term, then there is a little bit more leeway beyond the 3rd of June. So you might accept nominally an offer on UCAS, but you still have realistically a period of time, probably a month or 2 after that, so most of the summer, to consider whether or not you actually want to take up that offer, and you can reject it with relatively little risk even after accepting a given university's offer on UCAS. Then there's the question of how you feel about your other offers. So a lot of the students I meet to kind of discuss the reapplication conversation are instinctively quite kind of hurt by the idea that they kind of didn't get their top choice of university the first time around, and that kind of instinctively makes any other offers they might have got look a little bit kind of pale or weak or whatever in comparison. But it's important to understand that, one, an Oxbridge rejection is not necessarily an indictment of your abilities. I see lots and lots of students who kind of don't get into Oxbridge the first time around and either reapply successfully and do very well, or go off to other phenomenal universities, get first-class degree results from those universities, and honestly, in many cases, then go on to do masters or doctoral studies at Oxford, at Cambridge, and so on. So don't, if at all possible, feel too burnt by a single kind of initial rejection, which can have come down to very fine margins, and look at your other offers, consider them seriously. There are other phenomenal UK universities, and if you've got other offers that are coming from universities that you go up to the open days of and kind of like the campus, like the vibe, like the environment, think the course seems really interesting, then please genuinely kind of consider and think about that being the kind of the route you go down. So work through your feelings about other offers and try not to let the instinctive kind of sting of rejection from Oxford and Cambridge, from offers you might have wanted perhaps a little bit more, kind of influence too much your thinking about other universities. And then the other question is a little bit more of a logistical one, which is this idea of how you feel about a gap year and making good use of it. So a lot of students, and particularly, honestly, a lot of the parents I meet are quite hesitant about the idea of a gap year because there's this sense that it's just a year that you take out. You might do a little bit of part-time work. You might then do some traveling, but ultimately you don't use this year of your life particularly productively, and there's no specific reason to do it. Again, that's kind of an individual judgment and call to make, but certainly there are ways that you can use a gap year in valuable ways and do interesting things with it, and it can prepare you a little bit more kind of effectively for further study and so on. So lots of potential advantages to a gap year, but it's also thinking about how you feel about delaying your academic journey and process for a year, and of course being relatively organised about trying to make sure that you make good use of a gap year, because again, you spent the last probably 15, 16 years of your life with it kind of pre-organized by a school curriculum. And so suddenly you are free from that. If you're taking a gap year, there is no kind of fixed set of lessons or classes or lectures you need to go to on a day-to-day basis. And that can be great and freeing, but it can also kind of lead to a little bit of apathy, and it can lead to not doing anything particularly helpful or productive with that year out. So as an extension, and what I've tried to do is frame this, if we click back, I've tried to frame this pretty clearly as a list of pros and cons. So continuing the should I reapply question, we've got some pros and we've got some cons. And this is broadly how I would tend to frame the debate. So we've got this idea that there are higher overall success rates, and that's something that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail shortly. So first-time applicants overall are less successful than applicants who are either post-qualification applicants, so people who've waited to apply until they've got their final grades, or students who are reapplying, so students who are applying for a second time, going round again. So those reapplicants do, for most courses, all other things being equal, have higher overall success rates. There is no discrimination towards reapplicants, and again, a lot of people are suspicious when I say that, but genuinely, in my experience of having done this for quite a few years now and supported hundreds and hundreds of students every year, I've seen very little evidence of any discrimination towards reapplicants. There's a little bit of due diligence around that. So, for example, we'll tend to recommend that students apply to different colleges than those that they applied to the first time around and so on. But beyond that, there's no discrimination. So the universities assess each application on its own merits and don't kind of pull in any other data into that consideration. Your grades are locked in. So if you've already graduated from secondary school, if you've got your IB results, your A-level results, then you have a final set of exam grades. And one, that means that if you get an offer, it will be an unconditional offer. So it will be a stress-free offer. It means then kind of it is absolutely kind of your decision to go or not go to Oxford or Cambridge. It's not conditional upon further achievement, which can take a little bit of the pressure out of the application process. And it also means that you have a potentially really good, strong, positive data point in your favour. So you have locked in final grades or exam assessed rather than just predicted grades provided by your teachers, which particularly if they're very, very strong grades, if you've got multiple A stars or if you're a 43, 44, 45 candidate in the IB, that can be meaningful, that can boost your chances. You also, of course, have an extra year of study and preparation. That's not all brilliant because the admissions tutors, they will see that not necessarily you're a reapplicant, but that you are what we would call a post-qualification applicant, so that you are a year older than most applicants. And so they will understand that you've got the benefit of that extra year of study and preparation. And anecdotally, I do see reapplicants, particularly at interview, being held to very slightly higher standards than first-time applicants, just because they've got that extra or slightly extra degree of academic maturity. But for the most part, it's still overall a positive that you've had that extra year. And then logistically, it tends to be easier than the first application. So if you've already made an Oxbridge application, if you've already gone through the kind of the stress and admin and frustration of the process one time around, then although you will update and change things and hopefully improve things the second time around, you've done most of the legwork. So you've been through the process, it's familiar to you, it's a little bit less alien and weird and stressful. You've quite likely already done a lot of the preparation for any relevant entrance tests. You might already have a really good personal statement, which needs to be updated rather than completely redrafted, and so on. So it's typically a slightly a slightly path of less resistance to do the second application than the first. Success is not certain, however. So if you talk about the cons, then you can go around again and still be unsuccessful. And that's one thing to be braced for and aware of. There is no guarantee of success, even if you reapply. I meet students who are unbelievably strong and gifted, and I'm astonished when they don't get in. And even if they go around again, and I think they have a 95, 98% chance of admission, there are still some of them who don't. So you've got to be a little bit braced and not kind of and we'll talk about this a little bit more, you can't overinvest in the idea of kind of pursuing reapplication solely for the purpose, or kind of taking a gap year solely for the purpose of pursuing a reapplication, because if that's not successful, then you might well have delayed your entire life for a year by no reason. If you've not organised a gap year that's kind of positive and interesting, then you might have kind of just delayed everything for a year to no purpose, as I kind of mentioned in a bit there. So it delays your life by a year, obviously, then you are starting university a year later, you're graduating a year later, and so on. You're also outside of a school environment. So in some cases, and we'll talk about this as well, in some cases that can make the application process a little bit more complicated. In terms of planning a gap year, then it puts the onus and the pressure on you as kind of a student or potentially parents of a student who's considering reapplication to think about how to use that kind of big block of suddenly free time as productively as possible. And I would also just say other universities are great too. So although I literally work for a company called Oxbridge Applications, and I exist to kind of to a great extent evangelize how brilliant Oxford and Cambridge are, there are other phenomenal UK universities, there are phenomenal European universities, American universities, and so on. There are lots of great and exciting options, which may well have given you an offer already, and that it's really worth considering and kind of trying to see the kind of the upside and the awesome qualities within as well. So don't overinvest in this idea of Oxford and Cambridge as this kind of magical, wonderful place, because fundamentally they are just good universities, and there are lots of good universities. So just to continue a bit of the note of good news from earlier on, because I mentioned that reapplicants have a higher overall success rate. So this is just a little bit of data to hopefully illustrate that point. And we've just got a table here which basically maps the overall Cambridge offer rate. So this is across all courses, so averaged across all courses, and some courses are less competitive than this, some courses are more competitive than this overall average. But basically we've got a row that talks about the overall offer rate for Cambridge across all courses over the last the last 5 application cycles. And then we've got a row which talks about the reapplicant offer rate. So this is data that we've sourced directly from a Freedom of Information request submitted to Cambridge. And essentially, as you've probably already seen from the data in front of you, reapplicants, so people who have already applied once to the University of Cambridge as tracked by Cambridge internal data, they do have higher overall success rates. Of course, that sample size is a little bit self-selecting because the people who are reapplying tend to be relatively strong candidates. They tend to be candidates who, in many cases, have got pretty close the first time around. So who might well have been interviewed, who might well have requested feedback and got pretty positive interview feedback and been told that they were close to getting a place and have been encouraged in their reapplication journey because of that. But in net terms, reapplicants do still overall have a higher offer rate. So that's one positive to emphasize. And then there's a note here that I would just say that you've been through the process once already and you've benefited from that experience. So if you've applied already, then you've been through all of that stress and aggravation and kind of and that whole process, and you've benefited from that experience, or at least hopefully even without the kind of successful outcome, you've benefited from that experience in the sense that you know more about yourself, your academics, the application, how it works, and you're automatically, by virtue of all of that, likely to be a stronger candidate. So approach it positively. Think about how, sure, this is a kind of a temporary blip, or potentially a temporary blip, but you are potentially now a stronger candidate than you were the first time around, and you may have been relatively close to the offer already. So all of that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the logistics. So how do I reapply? How does it work? How does it fit together? And just a few points on that. So I'll just click through a few bits there. So at the top there, we've got this idea that, and this is what I will recommend to all of the post-qualification or all of the reapplicant students I meet, that you request feedback. So you will typically request feedback directly from the admissions office of the college you applied to. So usually they'll ask the candidate to email them directly. And if not, then they'll ask for written permission from the candidate that that candidate is happy to have their information shared. So if a parent wants to request that information, then you typically can't do that directly. You have to get your son, your daughter to give permission to the college to share that data with you before you get involved. So request feedback on the previous application. If you were shortlisted for interview, then typically most colleges will give you some feedback and are happy to provide that feedback. There are some colleges which are a little bit fussy or kind of lazy about it and kind of just say our policy is not to provide feedback, which is a little bit frustrating. So there are quite a few Oxford colleges that have that policy. But for the most part, if you've been interviewed by a college and then you submit fairly soon after the news of the rejection, you submit a request to get some feedback on how your application was viewed by the college, then they will get back in touch fairly quickly. So within a few weeks, with some notes, some information, some test scores, potentially some interview scores, in some cases, even a few paragraphs of information about what they felt about your interview performance and your responses to specific questions. So that can be really helpful in terms of contextualizing how it went the first time around. I don't think at the moment there's any fixed deadline for Cambridge. So Cambridge tends to be a little bit more chaotic than Oxford because the colleges are more powerful kind of relative to the central university. So individual Cambridge colleges, they may have their own internal deadlines to request that feedback, but that's not passed at the moment. So you can reach out usually fairly quickly afterwards. The deadline for Oxford, or at least the deadline for Oxford colleges to be kind of insisted, or kind of for Oxford to insist that colleges consider your request for feedback, is the 15th of February. So you've got a couple of weeks, essentially, if you want to request feedback from Oxford, to get that request in writing to the college you applied to. You've also, and this is one thing that quite a lot of students don't register, is you've got to reject any live UCAS offers. So if you would like to reapply, you'll be reapplying via UCAS, and you have to reject, so you have to clear out your UCAS to then apply to a fresh set of courses in a new, so the 2026-27 application cycle. And that does include deferrals. So for example, you can't get an offer from Durham on UCAS, ask Durham whether they were willing to defer that place for 2027. They say yes. You can't then keep that live on your UCAS and simultaneously apply to other courses for 2027 entry. So you have to reset everything. Again, that's a little bit of a risk. In my experience, again, even if you reject universities the first time around and then reapply to exactly the same universities, they don't tend to keep blacklists. So they're usually relatively happy to assess your candidacy from scratch the first time around. And if you got the offer the first time, you are very likely to get the offer the second time. It's not guaranteed, but in my experience, it's very, very likely. There's also the note about whether you apply via your school again or whether you apply as an independent candidate. And that's basically the note I've copied at the top, which is from the UCAS website. And this is the kind of the binary within the logistics of the application you make via UCAS, which is most of you will have applied by your school. So by your school and using it as a UCAS centre, and your teachers will have submitted reference data and predicted grade data and so on your behalf. Most schools are happy to let you do that again. So you can get in touch with your school and you can say, hi, I'm looking to reapply. Is the school willing to support that? Provide me with an updated reference and just kind of complete their side of the paperwork on that UCAS application. The vast majority of schools are happy to do that. They might provide less support than they did the first time around, because when you're applying, you'll no longer be an active student at the school. But it's worth checking, because if the school's not willing to support with that, then you have to apply as an independent candidate. And basically that just puts a little bit more of the administrative burden on you, requires you to submit all of kind of the grade data yourself. And then it also means that you have to independently seek out the reference. So the reference letter your teachers would have provided the first time around, quite often it then means that you have to get in touch directly with individual teachers at your old school and ask them whether they're willing to act as your referee this time around as well. And then you can nominate them specifically via UCAS. You will obviously also, as part of the application process, at least update your paperwork. So you've got a full set of paperwork. The statement is not changing this year in structure versus last year. So you can basically take your same statement. In most cases, use that as the basis of the statement you submit. But I will note that you should update it usually relatively significantly. So you should be thinking about, okay, I've done lots of cool stuff in the last year, in the calendar year, kind of in basically the full year since I submitted my previous application. How do I reflect that? How do I demonstrate that? What can I do to show my increased academic maturity, and so on? And similarly, your reference from the teachers should not just be copied and pasted. It should be updated to reflect, if possible, your final A-level or IB results, any particularly strong bits of your performance, and so on. So it shouldn't be last year's reference. Very briefly then, we've got the final few bits of the application process. So again, we can do this pretty quickly because lots of you will already have gone through that at least once. So we've got tests, written work, interview. So not all of these will be true for everyone. And it tends to be that STEM and social science subjects have tests and that humanities subjects have written work submission requirements. Pretty much, well, indeed, all Oxbridge undergraduate courses have interviews. So it is, for the most part, a rinse and repeat process. So the process that you were faced with in the 2025 application cycle would likely be almost identical to the process that you face in 2026, with a couple of potential changes. So if you swap either between Oxford or Cambridge, or you swap to a slightly different course, then there'll be a slightly different rubric for that course. In some cases, if you're swapping colleges, then individual colleges can have very tiny difference, like interview policy differences or slightly different preferences in terms of written work and briefings with written work. That's more common with Cambridge than it is with Oxford. And then there are a couple of bigger notes. So the Oxford tests are changing. This is an announcement that Oxford made literally a couple of weeks ago. So a lot of the Oxford tests, so the tests for engineering, for maths, for physics, for biosciences, for economics and management, for PPE and so on, all of that is changing for this 2026 application cycle. For the most part, the content of the test is not changing particularly. It's just suddenly that Oxford has decided to use the tests that have been used by Cambridge and Imperial in the last couple of cycles. So particularly the TARA, that's replacing Oxford's TSA. It's a very similar test, but it's slightly different in some ways. And then the ESAT is replacing the PAT and the BMAT, or the MSAT rather. And then you've got tests like the TMUA, which is replacing the MAT, and so on. So these tests are broadly analogous to the test that Oxford was using in 2025, but they are differently administered. They are all computer-based. The specifications and structures are a little bit different as well. You can follow the QR code in the corner of the screen there. You can scan that just to see that, and that should link you directly to Oxford's announcement of the test changes, which summarizes everything relatively neatly. It's also in terms of written work. So if you're applying for a course that asks for written work, it's something to discuss with your teachers, because ideally that written work is recent. If at all possible, you should not be submitting the same written work that you submitted with your first application, because that's going to be probably at least 18 months old by the time it's read by admissions tutors, and they want to see samples of relatively up-to-date written work. So written work that you've either got your teacher to set you in kind of the summer holiday after you finish school, just based on an A-level exam type question, or a more recent piece of work from one of your final terms at school, and so on. So ideally it's recent work. And then, as I've already referenced briefly, we strongly recommend you apply to a different college, even if you've kind of got really emotionally invested in applying to and getting in and getting a place at a specific college. I personally tend to think it's just strategically intelligent to move to another college, for the most part because it can be awkward to face the same interviewers who rejected you the first time around, which is quite likely if you're applying to the same course at the same college. Again, there's no theoretical reason they wouldn't if they think your second interview performance is better. There's no reason that they wouldn't necessarily kind of give you the place. They don't hate you, they don't dislike you, they're making serious academic discussions. But I tend to think it's easier to start with a blank sheet of paper, clean slate, apply to a different college, ideally get a completely fresh set of admissions tutors, although admissions tutors do move around colleges a little bit, and start again. So that's the one difference I would typically recommend a student makes. It's fine to apply to the same course, fine to apply to the same university, but I strongly recommend applying to a different college. Okay, so final tips, or at least a few final tips, and then we can move over to questions. So get the strongest possible A-level or equivalent grades. So A-level IB, kind of American AP grades. So complete out the year strong. I appreciate it can be demotivating not to have got the offer the first time around, but honestly, if you get really, really strong final results, you can be in a very, very strong position with your reapplication. If you have 3 or 4 A stars in your final results, if you have 43, 44, 45 in the IB in your final results, those are impressive scores, even by Oxbridge standards, and they are fully kind of locked in exam assessed grades. That is significant in terms of the weighting for applications to most subjects. So that is helpful, and focus on that if you're serious about the reapplication. Use your gap year productively, so including academic pursuits. I'm not going to get into too many specifics about how to use the gap year because that will differ a lot depending on the student, depending on the course you're applying for, what's productive, what's helpful. But the main general piece of advice I would say is in your application, which you'll be making in the first part of your gap year, you should be making, for example, references at least a little bit in your personal statement to keeping up some form of academic pursuit in your gap year. So you don't want admissions tutors to think you're just going to spend a year out kind of partying or traveling or doing a part-time job that's not at all related to academics, because then they're a little bit worried that you've spent kind of 18 months by the time you might start your degree course kind of not doing anything academic. So if you can talk about all the awesome extra reading you're going to have the opportunity to do in your gap year and how you've already begun that, or you're trying to get more work experience in a hospital if you're a medicine applicant, or if you're trying to kind of get some, you're trying to kind of do an online computer science course, so you're trying to learn linear regression analysis and doing an online Coursera course, exploring kind of particular statistical methods and approaches that you just didn't have the time to when you were doing your A-levels, then that's positive and that's helpful. And that doesn't need to dominate your gap year, but it should be something that you're making at least a gesture towards in your application. Apply to at least a different college, as we've just commented on, so we've already covered that. And I would also just say as a final note, try to stay healthy. So keep it fairly balanced. I like students to think about Oxford and Cambridge as nice, awesome goals that if you're successful at getting a place, that's great. And you're kind of hopefully off to a phenomenal university to have a great time. I went to Cambridge and I had an awesome time at Cambridge. But it should be kind of a happy ambition. It shouldn't be the end of the world if you don't get in. And there are other phenomenal universities. So it's being happily ambitious. The way I'd frame it is this kind of happy warrior ethos, the idea that you're going to give it a good go, going to put your all into it, give it a good fight. And even if you don't get the kind of the happy outcome, even if the second time around you don't get that kind of that offer, then you've still benefited from the process. You're still relatively happy and comfortable with your stage you're at. You're still probably going to an excellent university to have a great time anyway. And it's trying to keep that relatively in perspective and happily and healthily balanced throughout. Okay, so feel free, and I can see the question box is rapidly filling up, so we will approach that in about 30 seconds, but as you can probably see on the slide now. But just to talk briefly about a couple of follow-up points. So one thing to flag is that we have now got our Oxbridge Research Scholars Programme. So this is a programme that we're now launching for 2026, which allows students to independently pursue under kind of Oxbridge form of admissions tutor and Oxbridge mentors guidance an independent research project and essentially produce a paper not dissimilar to an EPQ or a kind of an essay competition paper under their guidance. And that can be quite a good, helpful way of structuring your work in a potential gap year with reapplication. And you can follow the QR code on the left to find out a little bit more about that on our website. And then on the right, then we've just got the link to the booking form for just a 20-minute introductory video call with a member of our team. So I do lots of those calls and take lots of those calls with families, and my colleagues do as well. And we're always happy to chat. So that just takes you to a Calendly link. So that's the QR code on the right-hand side of the screen, takes you to a Calendly link, and you've got basically a free 20-minute session to discuss with me or another member of the team your individual situation, ask us questions, talk through the situation with us in a proper amount of detail. And then if you'd like to pursue a reapplication, we can talk about how we might be able to help with that. Okay, so all of that said and out of the way, hopefully we've got about 15 minutes now to just go through some questions. And so we've already got 20 plus questions in the box, so I might not be able to do all of them, but I will try to answer a fair few, and hopefully some of these will be relevant to your situations. So, what's the most competitive course at Oxford University? Slightly out there one. So at the moment, it would be something like economics and management. So E&M at Oxford, it used to be about 5% off rate, but it went up in the last cycle. So it's now just over 6%. But then you have similarly competitive courses like computer science and maths and statistics and so on as well. And that's just in terms of headline statistics. That doesn't control for things like the relative quality of the average applicant and so on. So don't just obsess over headline statistics. This is a good question. So does it make sense to start studying at a university and then reapply to another one? Or must you necessarily take a gap year? That is a good question. And that is something I entirely forgot to cover in today's session. So thank you for asking that. I will typically fairly strongly recommend that if you want to have a good chance with your reapplication, that you take a gap year. So Oxford, Cambridge in particular, they don't tend to like poaching students who are already enrolled at other universities, particularly other UK undergraduate universities. And they would expect a very, very strong case to be made as to why you want to kind of change universities, as to why you want to leave UCL or Durham or wherever you happen to be. And it's not enough just to say, oh, I want to slightly upgrade my university in terms of rankings or prestige or whatever. Usually you have to have a very clear case, e.g., I've panicked, I'm studying English, but I actually want to study maths at university, and so I'm going to reapply for completely different courses. That might be enough to justify the switch of university, but the status quo tends to be, and you do, by the way, have to declare on your UCAS form whether you're currently enrolled or not at another UK university, so you can't hide that fact. They do tend to be very, very reluctant to take students who are already enrolled at other universities. You can do it. I've seen some students do it successfully and move over to Oxford and Cambridge. Usually you'd have to completely restart the course, so you typically can't transfer after first year to, say, the second year of an Oxbridge degree. So you'd have to start again, even if you'd done the full first year at another university. I have seen students make that transfer, but again, it makes an already competitive and difficult process even more so. We've got another similar question. So can I still take the place, start my first year in another university and reapply to Oxbridge? You can do. It's just not the strategically intelligent move. There is a chance that you make it successful, but again, most colleges and most courses are very hesitant to do that. Should you reapply to the same college which interviewed you? So that was a question that was asked a little bit earlier. So hopefully that question's covered. I recommend no. So unless you had a fantastic time in your interview and really want to see those people again, and the feedback you get is your interviewers talking about how they desperately wanted to take you, but unfortunately you were just very narrowly beaten out by one or two other particularly phenomenal applicants, then I would generally recommend that you apply to a different college, that you can kind of start with that blank sheet of paper. There's a question about presumably it being better not to apply via school if you're at a private school or an independent school. That's unfortunately not true, because when you apply via UCAS, all of that data about the school you were at is still on your application. So if you were at an independent school and your GCSEs and your A-level or your IB results were achieved at that school, then all of that school record is still attached to your application. And the admissions tutors will see the type of school you're at. You are still an independent school candidate, so it doesn't make any difference there. What if you have not applied to Oxbridge for this cycle, but are willing to redo the application process to include Oxbridge? So that's absolutely fine as well. You kind of just do everything pretty similarly to how we've run through and do make the application as you would have in the normal state of affairs, just going for the earlier October deadline this cycle, going through those additional hoops, so potentially sitting entrance tests, submitting written work, preparing for an interview, and so on. And unfortunately, you've just not had the kind of the experience that a reapplicant would have had, having gone through the whole process one time already. But otherwise, it's exactly the same process. In terms of success, is it better to seek school support or apply independently, or is it the same? It should be the same. So Again, this is why I'll typically recommend that students, if their school is willing to support them and apply via their school again, they just ask their teachers whether they're willing to support that. The vast majority of schools are very happy to do that, and it just makes things a little bit easier, but there's no strategic pro or con to doing one route over the other. What do you do about providing essays that the colleges want them marked by a teacher? And again, that's something that we referenced very briefly earlier. So the written work you're submitting, particularly for humanities courses, as a sample of kind of the kind of essays you can create. Usually the colleges want those marked by a teacher. What I'll tend to recommend is that you either use a relatively recent piece of schoolwork, so something that you produced in your final year of school, so ideally in one of the kind of the final couple of terms of your year 13 that you were particularly proud of, or that you get your teacher right towards the end of your time at school to set you an A-level type question and basically write an essay for them that they then can then potentially mark once you've left school over the summer, as if it was a piece of A-level work, just extending on the work you'd already been doing, and they can complete the cover letter on that basis, or the cover sheet on that basis. Yeah, so we've got a few other questions. Is there an option to enroll into a program at a foreign university for a year? Yes, absolutely there is. So you can do that. One thing I'd note is just look at the specific programs foreign universities are offering. So if you can do a really cool, interesting course for a year and you feel it builds up your CV in some way or your academic profile, that's great. So that's something that you can do and think about. But it's not like you will graduate with a degree probably from that university. It's not like that year at another university allows you direct entry to the second year of an Oxford or a Cambridge or usually another UK university's degree. So you've not necessarily kind of spent that year doing anything kind of more productive ultimately to graduating with a good degree than could have been otherwise achieved with a gap year. So it could be potentially a little bit of distraction. Also, however, UK universities are much less hesitant, so Oxford and Cambridge are much less hesitant about taking students and basically stealing them from international universities than they tend to be for UK universities. So that reduces that risk a little bit. And also, it could be a cool opportunity. It could keep your hand in academically, obviously, and it could be a cool opportunity to study abroad or internationally for a year. Would I recommend applying for the opposite university for a different course? So a couple of other elements to the switch there. So we've already suggested that you switch college. As to whether you swap universities, say you swap, for example, from applying to the Oxford geography course to the Cambridge geography course or vice versa, that's entirely up to you. Some courses, Oxford versus Cambridge, can be more or less competitive in terms of raw application statistics. So that's something to look into, and that varies course to course. So some courses, for example, Oxford history has a slightly lower off rate than Cambridge history, to give you a sense of it. So it might be kind of a strategic decision you're making on that basis, or you might look more in detail about the structure of the similar courses and apply on that basis. Or you might make a complete course switch and decide that instead of history, you want to apply for HSPS. So that's Human, Social and Political Sciences, which is a slightly weird course that Cambridge offers. And you might have decided that that's actually a course that is a much better fit for the spread of your interests, and you can make that switch as well. And that's all absolutely fine too. Just skimming through some of the questions, and I apologize that because we've got lots and lots of questions now, I apologize that I won't be able to get to all of these, but please, as I say, book in directly with us for a call to discuss them, and I'm just trying to pick out the questions that are potentially relevant to multiple people on this session while we're still on the call. Do students ever get admitted on appeal if there are medical circumstances? So that's a good and interesting note, because that might speak to a broader point about kind of appeals and so on. So essentially, you can make appeals to both Oxford and Cambridge. So you can appeal against the decision they've made. You usually have to do it fairly quickly, and there's a form for both universities that you can fill in to do that. The basis of any potentially successful appeal tends to be basically your ability to demonstrate that the information the university had available at the time they made the decision about whether or not to admit you was not a full picture of your situation. E.g., there was a kind of a significant illness happening, or there was just some information that wasn't correctly submitted by the school, or there was contextual circumstances that the universities were not aware of that paints the picture in a very different light. And if there is something that applies there, then it's worth looking at the appeal conditions. So kind of going on the Oxford website, again, appealing my decision, going on the Cambridge website and searching for appealing my decision. They both have web pages that explain that appeals process and the grounds you can make an appeal under. In my experience, those appeals are very, very rarely successful, but it's still worth going through the process. There's nothing lost by going through that process, particularly if you think you have legitimate grounds to make that appeal. And I have seen some students successfully get through via that route. It's unusual, but I have seen some students literally in February, in March, get offers ultimately from Oxford or Cambridge if they can prove that they weren't assessed fairly the first time around by a given college. So there's a note here about the written schoolwork being a little bit weak. So there's a concern around kind of the written work that the school submitted or that you submitted on the advice of the school perhaps being weaker than was needed and being the kind of the relative weak point in an application. Honestly, that's quite often something I see with candidates. So if your course asked for a sample of written work, then it can be a little bit of an issue. If the essay you submit is just a fairly casually written piece of A-level work that is a kind of a weekly essay that you kind of got a pretty good score in and that you submit because that's a recent piece of schoolwork, that's what Oxbridge has asked for. And unfortunately, there's a little bit more of a game quite often being played than that. So quite often a lot of students are kind of working quite hard and already planning kind of weeks and weeks in advance which piece of written work they want to submit and working quite hard on that essay before it goes to a teacher and planning that strategically and long term. And that can get in the way of students who are just kind of playing the system completely fairly and openly, who are submitting a recent piece of schoolwork that they were quite pleased with, but they've not thought about strategically. That can look a little bit pale in comparison when the admissions tutors read it when set against the kind of the long-term kind of planned pieces of work that other candidates are submitting a little bit more strategically. So one thing in terms of suggestion is request feedback. Quite often when you request feedback for a written work course, they will give a couple of notes and comments on the written work that was submitted. They may even have graded that written work. They may have given it a mark out of 10. They may specifically flag it as a weak point or a strong point on the application. So gather that information. And again, taking from that, if that is the weak point and you do want to reapply, do everything you can to submit stronger written work the second time around. And as we've already discussed, there are a few different ways of doing that. Just perhaps time for one more question and then we'll call a close. So let me just pick one that might be relevant. Actually, so the most recent question, I think that's probably a good one to address. And I apologise that we won't manage to answer kind of quite a lot of these questions. So probably missed out half or more questions posed, but please just book in for a call and we can try to answer those directly. So the final question we'll address today is there a summer pool, i.e. a student pulls out of the course? And again, if, for example, maybe a student doesn't meet the conditions of their offer, so a student was given an offer for a course at Oxbridge, but they don't get the final grades that was conditional upon, suddenly does that mean there's a place available? It does. There is a summer pool, and you can read about the summer pool, particularly on the Cambridge website. They've got a lot of information about it, but it tends to basically operate in a way that opens up places typically to students from underprivileged backgrounds or students whose applications had mitigating circumstances attached, or students that basically Oxford or Cambridge want to increase access opportunities to. So there is a summer pool. There are places available via it. Usually those places come or may come from or are made available by students who have not met the conditions of their standard offer. And those places are opened up to people who have already applied to Oxbridge and who have got good final grades, but who didn't quite get the place the first time around. But unfortunately, there is that slight additional note that those typically are places that are designed for and pre-designated for people who are kind of basically students that the university wants to increase access opportunities to. If you fall under those criteria, that's great, that's helpful, it can boost your application. So you can look at the access opportunities and criteria on both the Oxford and the Cambridge website, basically work out your individual eligibility for the summer pool. but the vast majority of applicants are not, unfortunately, eligible or typically eligible for summer pool places. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful, and I will not steal any more of your evenings. And as I say, hopefully you've managed to cover quite a lot of your questions, but I will set you all free. Enjoy the rest of your evenings. Please feel free to give us a call, either on the number at the bottom of the screen, so anytime during the week. So I and my team are always happy to chat, or you can book in for a consultation session with us to discuss directly via Zoom. Okay, thank you so much, and have a great evening, everyone. Okay.